Once again, welcome back to Mr. Scare. I have noticed that you guys enjoy listening to night driving horror stories. So for today's horror podcast, I have 7 new road trip horror stories. But before I begin, make sure that you have subscribed to Mr. Scare for regular uploads. So I work the night shift, so apart from the creepy things that I experience at my workplace, I am also driving at ghostly hours all the time. So one time I got permission to get home early from work because I was sick, and I decided to take the longer and slower road home. It was less bumpy, and although a longer road, it was a safer, and more importantly, easier way to drive home. So just for context, my usual way takes me 20 to 30 minutes to get home, but depending on the traffic lights, this way takes me around 40 to 50 minutes. It was obviously a longer route, but because of the lights, I didn't have to concentrate on the road as much. I was going through the town and managed to make all the lights so far. The time was somewhat like 3:20 a.m., so no one was on the road, and maybe that made it a little creepy. It was a cool misty night, and as usual, I saw a red light coming up, so I slowed down and stopped. I knew that light was going to take a while, so I whipped out my phone to check my messages. And as I was scrolling through my Instagram feed, I heard a bang on my passenger side door. The sudden loud knocking scared the shit out of me, and I dropped my phone on the floor and looked over to the window to see no one. At least for the first few seconds, because at first, there was no one to be seen at the window, but then slowly, a middle-aged drunk man rises from the bottom of the window, smiling like a creep. He did not even get to the top and just stopped in the middle of the window and slowly started tilting his head from side to side. It didn't look like he wanted food or anything, he just got some pleasure upon seeing me. So he just kept on staring into my soul until I felt like I was getting hypnotized. I mean, I never intended to pull my windows down, but I had already pulled them nearly halfway down. I kinda snapped out of it when his finger ring hit the door while he had tried to put his hand inside the car to unlock it. Needless to say, that was the only time when I've ever run a red light and touched the red line on my car's speedometer. In retrospect, I should have seen him somewhere around when I got to the red light. But I never did. I wonder how. But if he was a ghost or a spirit, what would be the need to unlock the door to enter inside? Maybe he was just a creep who wanted to steal my car or mug me. I got home and rested. Another time, I was taking my usual way home. I normally finish at 6:30 in the morning, but because of some scheduling issues at work, I got sent home at 4:30 a.m. So it was around 4:50 a.m., and I was doing like 90 miles an hour on the back streets heading towards my house. My high beams were turned on as I listened to music at full volume, having a great time by myself. I came around the corner, and it was quite a long road. But up the road within close distance, I could see someone in the middle of the road, wearing a white hoodie. So I flicked my high beams off and started slowing down, thinking that he was going to move. But he didn't. I stopped like 3 or 4 meters away from him and saw that it was a white sheet, draped over a standing stick thingy, with a piece of paper attached to it in big bold writing, saying "Come closer and have a look." Now I am not sure if it were some teens having some fun and pranking the drivers, or if I was going to get mugged after getting out of the car. But not being an idiot, I very quickly floored my car around the sheet and gunned it toward home. I got home and made sure everything was locked. I have a few more, but these 2 have been among the scariest that I have ever experienced. Because, unlike other instances, here I was probably just a few moments away from disaster. When I was in high school, my friends and I used to drive out to this graveyard that was just outside Hobart, Indiana. This was literally in the middle of nowhere, and at night it would be dark as hell. The entire cemetery gave off vibes of a top-level horror story. It was not so huge in the area, and it was claimed or rumored that there was an angel statue in the very middle of the graveyard. And whenever anyone got close to it, the temperature was supposed to drop. We had tried it before, and it did seem like this happened, like the temperature took a sudden drop. But I'm sure that it had something to do with just the weather. So one night, like 12 of us go just to get scared. We walk around the graveyard, explore it, and have a good time in general. I mean, we were teens at that time, and we got a kick out of such dumb things. We left from there after a while. We had in 2 cars. I'm driving behind the first one, and being a dumb 18-year-old, I'm following the girl driving the car in front of me pretty closely. It was a back road. It was not even well lit, and there were no other cars in sight for miles. Of course, that was the case since it was late as hell. All of a sudden, she swerves all the way into the other lane. I panic watching her do this, and I swerve too, thinking that there must be a deer in the front. She slows down and comes to a stop. I turn to spot the deer. But no, it was not a deer. There was a tombstone, that too in the middle of the goddamn road. It sounds like the stupidest thing you've ever heard, but I swear it. It was right there, in front of our eyes. Initially excited about this discovery, we gradually had a bad feeling about it. It looked freakish. And we had just been in a cemetery where all others looked the way they were supposed to. And this was no different, except that it looked demonic or sinister to all of us. It kinda compelled us or tempted us to get down and get close to it. But none of us dared to. And I'm not sure why or how, but all of a sudden, there was dead silence all around. No bugs or wind or any other sounds at all. I never intended to stay there for even a minute more, but as I said, we were dumb teens. Someone from the car ahead of us opened the rear seat door to step out. But before they could, a loud growl made us jump from our seats. It was followed by a subsequent set of loud footsteps that were heading toward us from the side. We floored it and gunned our cars to the town. We did not stop until we got to the main town and then parked on the side to speak about it. We decided to go there the next day to check it out. But yes, during the daytime. What kinda disturbed us was that it was our usual route while coming back home. And we never encountered such a gravestone in the middle of that road before. The next day, the previous night's encounter was still fresh in our heads as we drove towards it. We were very extremely alert this time. We reached and found that there was no such gravestone there. We were stunned. We drove around the cemetery twice and never run into it. And there were no signs of any digging done on the road too. It was as if either there was no stone in the first place, or it vanished into thin air. And I'm not sure as to which possibility should scare me more. And listen, I don't believe in ghosts. In fact, I don't believe in heaven or hell, or anything of that. But I know what I saw. And apart from me being one individual who might have imagined it all, there were 11 other people who saw the same thing. We talked about it for years to come. But no one seemed to believe us or our story. They thought we were just fooling around and making up a story. When I was about 17, my parents scolded me and sternly asked me to get home because a huge snowstorm was about to hit town. Not the town, the entire city, and surrounding parts, to be honest. I was at my boyfriend's place at that time and having a fun time with him. So when I was asked to get my butt home, I threw a fit, and my parents were like,
"Fine. But you have to drive yourself home and be home by curfew."
Oh, and just so you know, my curfew time was 8:30 p.m. Now I had never driven in the snow, especially in this kind of a snowstorm. It hadn't blown out in proportions, but there were signs that it was going to get worse and violent from there. I left his house around 6:30, and there were already about 4 inches of snow on the ground. And it was still snowing quite heavily. It was also pitch black out there. Driving in the snow is just creepy to the core. There's endless darkness around, and a white floor. So poor visibility and poorer grip on the road. Now both, my boyfriend and my parents lived in this small farming town, so I was only about 10 minutes up the road. So it should have been easy to get home, right? Hell no! The whole drive from his home to my home took around an hour. I couldn't see anything with the vortex of snow around me. There weren't many streetlights in my town. I could barely go and drive at a speed of 3 or 4 miles an hour in my tiny car. I might have been able to drive a little faster, but I did not want to risk my car breaking down in the middle of the road, and that too during a snowstorm. As I almost reached home and I could literally see my street, my headlights illuminated a little girl in the middle of the road. And what caught my attention was that she was not dressed for the weather at all. I slammed my brakes, but due to the snow, I skidded for about a quarter mile. I felt the impact of hitting her. I was praying that she would not have been hurt much. When I finally did stop, I got out with my phone's flashlight to look for her. But there was nobody to be seen. I decided that it was best to get home and tell my parents. We lived next door to the town's fire department, so my dad had called them up and asked them to go and look for her. They easily found where my car had put the brakes on, but nobody was there. There was damage to my headlight, so I definitely hit something, but they couldn't find anything. To this day my dad says it must have been a deer, but I know what I saw. And what surprised me more is that there were no trail or tracks of anything else on the road, apart from my car's tire tracks. Had there been a girl or a deer, there would have been some footsteps visible. I have no explanation for what I saw or for what hit my car that night. But it was something that gives me chills even today. I was around 23 years old when this happened to me. 3 of my girlfriends and I were driving from a city to a rural country house for a chill weekend. This was back in early 2005. The trip was fun. We were having fun on our journey to the place too. And everything was going normal as we got more and more rural and deeper into the countryside. It had started to get darker and darker as time passed, but we weren't so bothered by it. Towards the end of our journey, it was dark outside, and the road was barely visible to the eye. It was so twisty and bendy to drive on, and we were all getting more and more anxious since we didn't really know where this house was. Honestly, it felt like we were driving into the middle of nowhere. The area was totally isolated. Just trees all around us, and the path in front of us. Then suddenly, as we slowly twisted and turned down this black road which we could barely see, this haunting, creepy, horror-like music started playing from out of nowhere. It sounded like some haunting organ funeral music. And no, it wasn't coming from the radio. We knew that it was a possibility, but the radio was off for an hour or so because there was no network. Despite that, we turned it on again and then switched it off to hear the static. So it wasn't coming from the radio, and it was no one's phone too. It seemed like it was coming from inside the car. But it was weird. Not the music. I mean, yeah, the music was weird and creepy. But what I found weird was that all of us were sitting on different sides of the car. And if it was coming from one specific outlet, we all would have turned towards it. But that was not the case. All of us checked our very close to our bodies as if it was coming from within us. It was as if the music was playing in our heads. But in our heads? How? If one of us was hallucinating or imagining the music, then it would have been a plausible explanation. But this was unbelievable. It lasted for about 4 to 5 minutes as we drove through the route. For some seconds, it would get louder and then get lower, as if we were in some sort of a game. I mean, that's what my brother suggested when I narrated the incident to him. He said that in video games, music starts playing whenever we are near some enemy. And the music actually faded away as we drove further, and it ended once we moved past that area. We all heard it, and it was creepy as hell. To this day, I don't know what it was. But if it was some creepy ghost, then I am thankful to God that I could escape before it could do any harm to me. I went with my cousin on a trip to a beach in Mexico. While we were heading back from the trip, I decided to have a little nap, and in that nap, I had a dream about the television on the bus going on and off, and my cousin praying. I also dreamed about an old man with a little girl in a blue dress asking for a ride, to which I told the bus driver to not stop, because it was a spirit. Then in the same dream, I noticed that since we did not pick up the old guy with the little girl, everything changed and there was a fire on the hill, and we were trying to escape from it. At the end of the dream, we ended up in a little town in the middle of nowhere. I woke up from my dream suddenly, and when I told my cousin this story, he laughed at it. Then we started talking about other things, and all of a sudden, the televisions on the bus started to malfunction, and the bus driver told us that it was nothing. We both were a little worried and cautious about it. The both of us decided to go and talk to him, and that's when we noticed an old man asking for a ride with a little girl wearing blue. Now we were in the middle of the mountains, and there was no one living there. Literally no towns and no life. And then a few miles later, there he was again, asking for a lift. I told the bus driver mockingly that it was a ghost. He laughed and told me that it was the third time that he saw it. My cousin was so scared that he started praying. I was starting to think that I was still in a dream. But I guess I wasn't. We got into a military checkpost where there were only 4 guys there. One of them told us to be careful because since it was winter season, the roads were slippery because of the altitude of the mountain. Around 20 minutes later, we noticed a huge fire in the mountains, and the bus stopped working. There was no cell phone signal, and there were no cars passing by, and it was freezing outside. Finally, a girl passenger managed to find some signal on her device and contacted 911. They were coming for us, and while we waited inside the bus, there was something or someone outside knocking on the windows of the bus. And not just me, but all of us could hear little feet running around on the roof of the bus. We went outside to see what it was, and it was nothing. 5 ambulances arrived and took us to a little Masonic town. So yeah, we ended up in a town in the middle of nowhere, exactly like my dream. Ever since I got my license, I've done a lot of driving, especially long distances across the country, and that too at night. I've never rarely ever had anything unexplainable happen to me, but I've had my fair share of scary and creepy stuff. One time when I was driving out in the West, I saw a road covered with hundreds of rattlesnakes. The only explainable part is that they like the heat of the pavement, and that might have pulled them all outside their dwellings and on the road. The scary part is that I drive a big semi-truck, and I gotta go to different places. So I was running over rattlesnakes, and for some reason in my mind, I am thinking that one of these snakes is going to be hanging underneath the step up into the truck and bite me when I get out at the next stop. Needless to say, I just chose to jump from the truck as far as I could. But then when I got back in the truck, I realized that I had left my door open when I went about my business. So I started thinking if one of those snakes entered the truck. I drove the entire way with one eye on the road, and the other eye searching for snakes hiding inside my vehicle. I remember another incident when I had moved to a very rural town in Michigan and lived outside of that in an even smaller town. That town was what one might call the dark sky territory. Anyway, it was my first night staying there. I had only seen a couple of locals, and they definitely looked like the hills have eyes kinda way, with U-shaped mullets and the bald spot on the top. Everyone kept eyeballing me as I drove by. Anyway, there was a thunderstorm there, and the power went out in the cabin where I was staying in. It was the darkest experience I've ever been in. Pitch black all around the place. Something or the other was making noise all night long, and I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. Back then I didn't have a flashlight, lighter, cell phone, or anything with me. In the morning when I got up, the windows on my car were all busted, and there were no branches laying around. So yup, I got in the car and just drove the hell right out of Michigan to Minnesota. Way before COVID happened, Walmart used to be open 24/7. My husband had the second shift, so he would get off work late at night. After work, we would go and visit Walmart. So this took place at around 3 or 4 a.m. in the middle of the night. On our way back home from Walmart, maybe a block from our house, we saw an elderly woman walking in the middle of the street in her nightgown. She had white hair, and I won't deny that we didn't get a bit freaked out. We calmed down and drove up to her. We asked if she was okay, to which she replied,
"I'm looking for my husband. Have you seen him anywhere?"
She looked confused. We didn't know where she lived, so we called 911. We told her we would wait with her till her husband showed up. After a few minutes, the cops showed up. It turned out that she had Alzheimer's disease and lived 3 blocks down. She had wandered off and was looking for her husband who had passed away a long time back. My husband had another creepy experience. This happened back when he was still my boyfriend. We weren't driving, and we were sitting outside my old house around 2 a.m. It was the summer before going back to school for our senior year. We're talking with our camping chairs outside, snacking on some goodies. That was when we saw a man dressed in a long sleeve and white shirt, sliding. Not walking, but sliding in the middle of the park. I used to live in front of a big park, and at night it would be very dark with trees all around and only a couple of light poles. It was so creepy to see that it still gives me the chills. This incident happened to me back when I worked as a manager at a certain chain of restaurants around 2014. We had to stay later than usual to clean flour and water stuck to the floor. It wasn't a rare occasion that we had to clean it up, as we generally had to do it every once a fortnight. I had a coworker who was kind enough to stay a little later to help close, in exchange for a ride home, which I willingly agreed to. We finished up our work and he was giving me directions on where to go, and I ended up driving to a part of town that I didn't recognize. Now I moved to this town a year ago, and I had explored it quite a bit. But this one was new to me. Or maybe I had been there before, but during the day, and hence the place seemed far from familiar in the middle of the night. The place had a lot of farmland and open fields, and that was common over here, so it didn't surprise me. But this vast stretch of farmland felt scarily empty. I kept driving in the direction he told me without any questions asked, mainly because I knew he was a nice guy. It must have been around 1:30 a.m. by the time I dropped him off at his place. I start taking the empty rural road back, feeling a bit sketched out. I was on the lookout for anyone lurking around. And as I got close to approaching the part of the road where the traffic lights were, that's when I noticed them. There was a whole group of around 10 or so people fist fighting in the middle of the road. They looked like the stereotypical description of Latino gang members. Long white shirts, mustaches, bald heads, you know, the typical look. Apart from the fact that I wondered why they were fighting at night on the road, the creepy thing that I noticed was that they all looked identical. It felt like I was watching clones fight amongst themselves. As I got closer to them, they all stopped fist fighting and turned to look at me, almost in sync. I was about 20 to 30 feet away from them, slowly inching forwards because I was obviously not planning on running over those people. They all looked like deer caught in the headlights. And then they all started running towards me. They dashed at a speed that shook me. It was as if they were all racing each other to see who could get to me first. I panicked immediately, swerved off the road, and drove around them. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw that they quickly gave up on the idea of catching up to me. I made it out without injury or damage to my car, but from that point, I never offered rides to anyone from work. I told my colleague about last night's incident. He reacted as if I was bullshitting something. I mean, he literally laughed it off. When he noticed the look on my face, he asked me to narrate the entire incident again. I gave as many details as I could remember. He shook his head and said it was impossible. Latinos have never been seen in the town ever since he was born. It was a very small town. He also mentioned that the vast farmlands have always been empty. To this day, I am still confused about what I had seen that night. My only logical explanation is that the farmlands aren't abandoned. They are being used by a Latino gang to carry on their illegal business. I never mentioned this possible explanation to anyone, mainly because it even sounds like a made-up story that I saw 10 identical people fighting in the middle of the street that too at night. So I never brought it up again, or even went close to that part of the town. So before I tell you what I encountered, let me tell you that I live near to a park, and thus I have to drive by it every night when coming home from work. One Friday night, I was returning home as usual when I saw a little girl in a red dress, riding her bike in the parking lot next to the park, just going in the same circle, under the light of a street lamp. It looked odd to me, but I shrugged it off as we all did stuff that looked weird as kids. And I had never had any creepy or spooky encounters here. Forget my experience, I had never even heard about it from anyone living around here. Then on Monday night though, I see the girl again, same red dress, riding her bike in the same way, but I observed that she looked older. I try to observe closely, but I just shrug it off thinking I just didn't get as good a look the last time I saw her. On Tuesday night though, I start to really realize that something is up, as I saw a teenage girl wearing the same dress and riding in the exactly same manner was seen there. On Wednesday night, it was now a woman in her early 20s. The next night it looks like a woman pushing 40. At this point, I start to get really unnerved, and since Friday would be my last shift before a few days off, I considered taking a long way home just to avoid seeing this odd sight, but I told myself that I was being irrational and ended up driving home using the same way anyway. I kind of wish I didn't, as that night I swear I saw what looked like a pure black silhouette of the woman standing in the center of the street light, as the bike went around her with no rider. Instantly, I turn away to look behind as a cold sweat overtakes me. Suddenly I'm more scared that I can't see this thing anymore, so I turn back to where it was, and for the briefest moment I saw the woman looking to be in her 70s staring dead at me, her hair pure white and her eyes milky as if she was blind, but then I blink and the parking lot was empty. After that, I never saw anything like that again. But it scarred me forever. I never bothered to take that route ever again. Now it has been several years since that incident, and while a part of me wants to say that my mind has exaggerated the details of it, but I still get that same cold sweat thinking about it. I even spoke to a psychic friend of mine. She suggested that when such things happen, they are trying to reach out to us. Maybe to convey something. She also pointed out that if it wanted to harm me, it had ample opportunities. But it never did. So there must have been something that it wanted to tell or show. But the message was lost forever, as I never saw her again. I hope she found someone else who had the guts to be approached by a spirit without getting spooked. I have a memory of that one time when my 5 friends and I went to get some hot dogs for dinner. Once we were leaving the food truck after eating the hot dogs, we decided to drive across a creepy and weird neighborhood because it saved a little more time compared to the main streets that had a dozen traffic lights involved. A friend of mine was driving and I was in the back seat with 2 other buddies. We got to the end of a block and stopped near the end despite there wasn't any stop sign. Now we actually could have just driven past that block because we didn't have a stop sign. But there was an old yellow school bus, which for some reason caused my friend to stop. The bus had its high beams on, so we couldn't see who was driving, but we all stared at it for a brief moment. The bus was not in our opposite direction, but perpendicular to us. There was a crossroad and it had stopped there because that road had a stop sign. We waited for the bus to pass. But the bus didn't move even after waiting for like over a minute. So my friend decided to keep moving straight towards home. The very instant when he started accelerating, the bus literally pushed bottom on the fuel pad and drove towards us as if he wanted to hit us. We all panicked and started screaming because he was going to actually crash into us, and it was going to be a big hit. And since we were pretty close, we knew that a crash was inevitable. My friend kind of moved the wheels to the side as much as he could, so as to get as much distance as possible to try to drive across the street before the bus hit us. Our wheels screeched as we barely managed to prevent the hit, but we got past the street without touching the bus. We just looked at each other for a few seconds thinking about what happened. We got out of the car to see what the fuck was wrong with the bus driver, just to find out it was gone. There was no sight of it, not even in the distance. Now, this was impossible because it was a very long block to have made it across it and taken a turn, that too in less than 10 seconds. We still believe that it was a ghost bus. And in hindsight, it did feel weird to see a school bus at that hour. Although the beam lights were on, they were extremely strong. It made it difficult to even look at the driver. And the backside of the bus was dark. I don't know what it was, but it was creepy as hell. My friend jokes that it was picking up stranded wizards and witches who were going to Hogwarts. When I was about 9 years old, I had a routine with my dad. I would go with my father to his office for a few hours during the week, and he would drive my brother and me back after dark. It was a one-way bendy path through the woods, with cliffs on either side of it. We never had any trouble there. It was mostly an isolated one. And by isolated, forget humans, we rarely even saw any animals there. The road was really narrow, and then in the middle, it got to the size of a normal two-lane road, and then it became narrow again. Every night, our drive would be going fine until we drove past the narrow road. Because at the end of that large part of the road where it would narrow again, I'd always see a dark figure standing there. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, let me inform you that I've always had issues with seeing things. I'm a little schizophrenic. So I assumed it was nothing other than a figment of my imagination, but it was still freaky. I don't know how to describe it properly. But it was a big black thing with white slits as eyes, and had no hands or feet. Maybe like a Minecraft character. I had told my father about it a long time before. My father would always tell me that it was probably a tree, but we wouldn't know it for sure because we were never there during the day. Our way to the office was different from our way of returning from it. So we always got there at that spot at night when the visibility wasn't so clear. Now we always ignored it until one night after about a year of us driving past it, because that night, it moved from its position and it ran out in front of the car so quickly that we couldn't see it. My dad called it a black deer and left it alone. I could sense that he too wasn't so convinced by himself. The very next time he drove back through there, it was without my brother and me, and he went off the side of the road, down the cliff, and snapped a street light. He said he hit that black deer, but also claimed that that was in no way a deer. He said it stood on its back legs and almost looked like a very human. After that, we never went down that road for many years. But after a couple of years, I again had to use that road for my work, but I never saw it. The other day I was talking to my stepsister about the accident that my dad had had on that road. Mind you, I just said he swerved while driving, and I didn't say why. More than not wanted to scare her about that road, I did not want to scare myself about it. I told her about it and she said,
I always hated that road. There was always this big black thing standing there and watching me pass by.
A chill ran down my spine, and I never bothered to go through that route ever again. This happened when I was heading home from work at around 11:30 p.m. one night, and the road which I was taking transitioned to a country road after crossing over an interstate. On the right were a few houses and a recycling place, all of which were dark, desolate, and quiet. On the left of me was the huge food distribution center for all the grocery stores in that area. And that side was all lit up and still bustling with activity. I passed the center's gatehouse, and between me and the gatehouse was this shadow. There were no details to it, and there was nothing else that could be really seen there. It was just a human-shaped shadow that appeared to be completely covered in long shaggy fur. This thing was supposedly taller than my full-sized pickup truck too. For the non-American people, that truck's cab was taller than a full-grown man, and this shadowy thing that I saw was taller than the truck. It wasn't until a further half-mile down the road that I processed what I had seen. The other people in the truck saw it too. But we never saw it again. It was impossible for that shadow to have cast it over there. Just plainly unexplainable. But being a truck driver, this was just one of the many creepy shits that we have encountered. I remember another incident when I was coming home from the grocery store after work, and it was about just some minutes past midnight. I live out in the countryside, so the roads leading to my house really don't have any lights on them, and wild animals alongside or on the road are a common sight for us locals living here. I topped this rise, and right there was something. My first thought was that it must be a large raccoon or a possum, but I was not quite convinced about it. I slowed down to avoid hitting it, and it turned its head and looked at me. It had a human-like face, with a long snout instead of a nose, and its eyes were glowing yellow because of my headlights. It had long hair hanging down on either side of its face, long enough to nearly touch the road. My brain was trying to process and grasp whatever I was seeing in front of me. I tried to look more closely, and that's when I noted that I could see through it. Yes, I could actually see the road past its body. And except for its glowing eyes, it was all gray and shadowy, and I could see the path behind it, through its body. After a minute of staring at me, it ran off into the shadows of the ditch. And I never saw it again either. I did ask my family and neighbors about it. The ones of my age were unaware of it. But the adults and mainly the old people were visibly worried and hiding something. I did not prod much because I figured maybe it was best kept a secret. I used to drive a trailer for almost a decade. Some years back, I was on a run to pick up 4 cars on a trailer from Virginia and back to Iowa. I drove the entire way there without stopping, except for the usual bathroom breaks. I had planned on grabbing a motel room when I got there. I wanted a room so that I could have a good sleep and get refreshed before turning around to come back home. I mean, despite being a seasoned driver, it does get very exhausting after driving for hours at a stretch. I mean, the body usually gets accustomed, but not the mind. Long stretches of roads generally take a toll on the mind, and a good night's or afternoon's sleep does the trick. Now I wasn't tired when I got to the spot. I had drunk a few energy drinks during the trip, so I loaded up the cars and turned around, and figured I'd stop whenever I got tired. That way it would save some miles and shorten the journey for the next day. So I kept driving until got pretty late at night. I was driving through the mountains of West Virginia and starting to get tired and sleepy. I was on the lookout for a motel, but I didn't see anywhere to stop for a while that didn't look too shady. My eyes were shutting as I was getting a little drowsy. All of a sudden, I see a person crawl up out of the ditch on the side and lay down on the side of the road. I'm doing 70 or so with 3 cars on a trailer and going down a mountain, so I couldn't exactly slam on my brakes or anything. I did the best that I could do in that situation, which was just dialing 911. I kept my phone on speaker as I kept driving my trailer. I told the cops, "I don't know if I've just been awake too long or what, but I'm pretty sure I just saw someone climb up onto the road from the ditch. It was too real to be a hallucination." The cops said that they would check it out and that they were getting the same call from a couple of other people. I was surprised because there were hardly any other cars on the road. But on the other hand, I was glad that I wasn't hallucinating. But it was getting late. So I decided that I would stop at the next exit and find somewhere to stay. The next morning, I turned on the news in the hotel and it said that a guy had crashed his motorcycle a day earlier and barely alive, he had climbed up to the road. Sadly, he had died as soon as he had made his way up there. Now I was feeling bad for the guy when it struck me that when I saw him, he was alive and moving. But the news channel reported that he had died a day earlier. How was it even possible? Was it a ghost that I had seen? And not just me, a considerable number of travelers had seen him. I belong from the northeastern part of Pennsylvania, far into the Appalachian wilderness. There is a marsh not so far from where I live, which is locally notorious for having a large black mountain lion living in it. Let me be very clear that not me, but almost everyone from out of my town says mountain lions don't live in Pennsylvania, but several people in my town have reported it, including local wildlife experts. Now I don't know how I feel about it, but it scares me just the same as others residing here. I have never seen it. But if there's a possibility of it existing, then I need to be cautious. I was driving home one night late from work and decided to take my old Hyundai Sonata through the marsh road instead of the slower way through the town. On either side of the road, tall cattails blocked vision beyond about 15 to 20 feet. At the edge of my lights, I saw something slink across the road, and at first, I assumed that it was a dog. So I pulled up to where it entered the reeds, rolled down my window, and called out to it, saying something along the lines of,
"Hey boy, come here."
I heard a deep growl followed by a terrifying shrieking noise. Then I saw a pair of eyes reflecting in the bushes, walking toward my car. I gunned the gas and drove the rest of the way home without stopping. I don't know what I saw or heard that night. I suppose that it could have been a few different animals making noises at the same time. But I've hunted for years and I know what bears, foxes, coyotes and most other wild animals sound like, and it didn't sound like any of those. I've always told everyone that I had seen the infamous black cat that night, but in all honesty, I don't know. I don't walk unarmed through that part of the marsh anymore though. But those eyes had stared right into my soul and the growl made my heart stop beating for a moment. It could have just pounced over at my car and shattered the glass. But maybe it didn't want to. All it wanted to do was announce his presence. After all, we were residing in his territory. About 7 years ago, I was driving across the New Mexico and Colorado border at around 3 a.m. I was supposed to drive another 150 miles, and I knew I didn't have enough fuel. I was looking for a place to stop and refill my fuel tank. I had missed one gas station when I was in a dilemma if I should stop and refill at that moment or find one a few miles further. But after skipping that one, there wasn't a single one visible for over an hour. I was worried, and mainly it was late. I did not want to be in the middle of nowhere when I run out of fuel. Luckily, I happened to reach a town that was probably the smallest and saddest little farm town, and it had only one tiny gas station. Now I hadn't seen another car on the highway for hours, and it was freezing cold outside. I drove to reach the gas station that looked like a food takeaway joint. And honestly, it felt like this town was abandoned like a ghost town. I mean, it was that quiet. Total pin drop silence, apart from my engine. And forget humans, I don't even spot any cars parked anywhere. Frankly speaking, I felt that it was kind of a cool place to explore, except for the unbearing cold weather. Now as I approach the station, I don't see anyone around at all. So I wear an extra jacket and jump out of my truck. I'm pumping away and refilling my truck, feeling like I'm completely alone in this whole damn town, until I notice another car in the shadows, quietly sitting near the back of the building. It was a flashy black lowrider with completely tinted windows. And there were 4 guys leaning against it. And I don't know how to describe those 4 people's outfits and looks. But for me, the simplest way to help you picturize them would be by asking you to visualize a gang of 4 men in a Mexican gangster movie. Yes, I am not exaggerating. And I remember chuckling to myself in slight shock because firstly, they startled the hell out of me. And secondly, they were wearing black shorts, wife-beater tank tops, and the usual knee-high socks. Now do not forget that it was freezing cold out there, and it was the middle of nowhere. Despite that, they looked so damn casual. And without a word, all 4 of them got off the car. They started walking straight towards me, until I could see the full sleeves and face tattoos under the lights of the gas station that I was in. I dropped the gas pump, dashed inside my truck, fired up the motor, and did the quickest 0 to 100 that my beloved truck had ever witnessed. And while I jumped into my truck, I remember them shouting and running toward me. I shut the door and gunned towards the exit. I did not want to be in this town any longer. I sped my way and got to the highway. But not 30 seconds after burning out onto the highway, I noticed headlights swerve out onto my lane and follow me. Little did they know, I beat up looking at a Dodge truck that had the Hemi motor and a couple of cool upgrades. I knew that they never had a chance to catch up with me. I was startled by the noise of a gunshot. I sped as fast as I could, and I'll be honest with you, at one point, I thought I might burn out my engine. But I had to risk it. These crazy men might be wanting to loot or kill me, or sell off my body parts to some black market, and I couldn't risk myself getting caught by them. The road was pretty smooth, and that helped me maintain pace, or for that matter increase our gap too. And after a few miles, I heard another loud gunshot. And their headlights disappeared in my rearview mirror. I kept driving because another trucker friend of mine had told me about a similar incident, where he assumed that he was not being chased anymore, only to learn that they had stealthily crept closer to him with their lights off. Although in my case, I was lucky. I kept driving for the next few hours and eventually got where I was supposed to reach. They were pretty surprised, because I had reached significantly earlier than they had expected. I mean, of course. I didn't think much of it, and even laughed at how badly I outran them, till a cop buddy told me something that sent shivers down my spine. As a cop, he was aware of the Mexican cartels running drugs through that ghost town to avoid the interstate. I was stunned to know that my guess was correct. And it took me a while to grasp the reality that I had pulled myself out of those jaws of death. And from that day onwards, no matter how desperate I am, I do not enter their ghost towns or abandoned places. They are abandoned for a reason, and it is best to leave them that way. So this happened when my young wife and I were moving between cities. We had spent the entire day loading a large 16-foot trailer with all our belongings. It tired us out and we were left exhausted by the end of it, but we did not rest. Mainly because we wanted to begin the drive across the state, just before it got dark. And mind you, this was way back in 1980s. The headlights weren't as strong back then. I had borrowed a large pickup truck to pull the heavy trailer to our destination, so the combination of this truck and the fully loaded trailer was extremely heavy. And because of its heavy weight, it was pretty slow and cumbersome to start and stop the truck. We were traveling along a very desolate stretch of the highway at around midnight. We were driving roughly 60 to 65 miles per hour when I noticed something that looked like a couple of deers walking out into the road ahead of us. And they were like around 200 yards ahead of us. My wife was fast asleep on the seat next to me. I began to slow down a bit because I knew it'll take a while to slow down, and meanwhile, I pressed the horn to scare the animals off the road before we would reach them. Now where we live, this is a fairly common occurrence. These dumb deers randomly show up on the road. Or worse, they jump onto a moving vehicle and shatter the window glass unintentionally. But they are startled by loud noises, and horns generally scare them off easily. So I'm not slamming on the brakes in full force, because I expect these deers will move well before we get there. You know, as I said, they usually do that. But for some reason, they stood firm, and that put me in a state of panic. As we got closer, I suddenly realized as these two so-called deers came clearly into the light of our headlights, that these aren't deers. They were two men, and they were trying to stop our truck. Now the road we were driving on was only a two-lane highway, and one man was standing in the middle of our lane, and the other was standing right in the middle of the opposite lane. By now there was absolutely no way that I'm going to be able to stop this rig, and they weren't leaving me anywhere to go. They had their reasons to expect that I would be eventually stopping, unless I was a psychopath that would run my truck over them with no regrets. But they didn't realize that I couldn't stop. It was beyond my capacity to stop the truck at that speed, and that too within that short, ever-decreasing distance. I stomp on the brake pedal and continue to blare the horn over and over again and as fast as possible, hopefully getting them to move off my path. I'm fighting to keep the truck and trailer from jackknifing, brakes locked up and tires screaming, but these guys are not moving or showing any signs of fear. All this while I'm still going 35 to 40 miles per hour when I had almost reached them. The only thing that I could do at that point was to try and thread through the needle-like gap between them. So I center the truck in the middle of the roadway and hope that neither of them tries to close that small window. At the very last second, the guy who's standing in the middle of our lane jumps out of the way. He was so close that I was seriously worried our big rearview mirror might hit him in the head. I missed hitting him by mere inches. This all happened in a span of about 5 to 10 seconds. There was no car anywhere on the road, and we were way out in the middle of nowhere, and it was pretty obvious, based on their behavior, that these two guys were up to something potentially nefarious. I didn't stop, and I didn't even bother to. I had already come way too damn close to killing these guys. My heart was literally in my throat, and it was pounding so hard that I was having trouble breathing for the next few minutes. I didn't even realize until afterward that when I'd slammed on the brakes, my wife had slid off the seat and onto the floor of the truck. Just FYI, seatbelts were not mandatory back in those days. She groggily gets up off the floor and asks me,
"What the hell just happened?"
She had missed the events that had unfolded merely a minute ago. And I'm thankful that she didn't, because it would have scarred her for life. It scared the shit out of me. And I've never come so close to killing someone in my life, and I truly hope I never do again. Oh, and by the way, we reached there safely. And we unpacked a day later. We settled well over there and got accustomed within a week itself. I made friends with the local sheriff as he was my neighbor too. And over a drink, I told him about this entire incident from that night. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that I should have had run my truck over those criminals. Because good people stop their cars so as to save the lives of these goons, they end up getting looted or worse, murdered. And sometimes they even target cop cars, where they pretend to be lost and in need of help. Then the moment they find the officer is not alert, they attack and steal whatever they can. And at night, it is always difficult to make out and remember the faces. And he mentioned that I could always claim that I had to run over them for my own safety, which was more than justified in the eyes of the law. Henceforth, I have made it a point that if I ever encounter such goons, I would realize my lifelong dream of playing GTA with my real car. But jokes apart, if that's what it takes to save my family and myself, I would do it without any regrets. What about you? Before I begin, I'll provide a bit of background. I'm a truck driver, and unlike the usual long-distance drives, I was specifically doing shuttle runs for a factory in my city. I run loaded trailers from the factory downtown to a warehouse that is situated around 20 miles away. That warehouse is where I drop my loaded trailer, exchange it for an empty one, and take it straight back to the factory where I started my journey. I run this route like 8 to 10 times a night every day. I'm told that it's a diamond in the rough as far as trucking jobs go. Anyway, my route has me cross this rather precarious highway bridge on each return trip. The bridge is only 2 lanes wide, with no shoulder. The speed limit on the highway is 70 miles an hour, but this bridge has a steep drop and a sharp curve down to surface level, so the recommended speed to take this curve is 45. A few months ago, around 2 a.m. on a Wednesday, I was in the process of rounding this curve when a car was blocking the bridge, and I nearly plowed right into it. The car didn't lose control or smash into anything, there weren't any tire tracks on the pavement, and the car didn't have any damage. The car was a brand new Mercedes SUV with dealer tags, so it probably wasn't broken down. And nobody was in the car. Whoever was driving must have just decided to come to a complete stop in the middle of this practically blind corner, get out of his car, and walk away. The car couldn't have been there for longer than 30 minutes or so, because it wasn't there when I drove past that bridge in the other direction. I didn't see anyone walking along the highway too. I have no idea what was going on, and I called the cops to get that car, and I never heard anything about it that night. A week later, another driver told me about what he had heard. Apparently, a man had committed suicide on the bridge that night. He jumped down that bridge while he was on his duty. The reason was unknown, but the body was found a day later. It gave me chills knowing that had he been there 30 minutes earlier, I might have had the opportunity to save his life. Rest in peace. About 15 years ago, my sister and I were driving on our way home. It was quite late at night, and the road was deserted at that hour. The stretch of that road is around 3 miles, and it is surrounded by trees on both sides. We were speaking about random stuff on the way, and suddenly we could both see something on the road up ahead. It wasn't still. It was moving at a constant pace with our car, but it wasn't running and it looked weird. So I asked her what it was, and my sister said she too didn't have a clue. And I don't know how to describe it, but it looked like a black garbage bag. My sister too said that it really looked like a bag flying on the road, flapping along the wind to stay afloat. I was curious, so I sped up a bit and tried to catch up with it. Now you wouldn't believe it, but as we approached, it completely changed its shape. It went from being quite flat and small to morphing into a fully grown man on a bike. He was just there in the middle of the road, riding his bike. We were dumbstruck by what we had just seen. And all of it happened within moments. Maybe 10 seconds. I caught up alongside him and asked if he was okay. He nodded but didn't speak anything, and then he drove off at an unmatchable speed. The most peculiar part is that it made no noise. I mean, generally, a motorcycle would get noisier after speeding up, but this one did not. And this was like in the early 2000s, so today's technology did not exist. To this day, we still talk about it because it was the strangest, creepiest thing ever, and we both still can't explain what we saw. My bet is that it was some sort of secret government tech, while my sister believes that it was an alien that we saw. When I mentioned it to my friends and family, we joked that it must be some sort of secret teleportation technology. I was around 20, and I was driving home from my boyfriend's house. It was a familiar route, so I wasn't super cautious or worried per se. I stopped at a red light on the very edge of town. I remember all of the city lights were behind me, while the cornfields and shelter belts were ahead of me. Now, because it was like around 3, and that too in the middle of the night, I was the only one sitting at the red light. It was a pleasant night, and I had had a great time meeting his parents. While reminiscing about those moments, I saw something moving in my peripheral vision. Now, because of my location, I thought it was going to be a deer. But deers don't creep in towards you. They'll either jump in or out randomly. This one seemed like slowly creeping in on me, you know, like a predator. I slowly turned my head and locked eyes with a man who was maybe in his 50s. I was relieved, as I'm paranoid about bobcats already. But I wondered, why was he creeping towards my car? When he noticed that I saw him, he froze, and it was then that I noticed he had a tire iron. I ran the red light and sped out of there. I called my boyfriend and told him about it. He took his car, and his elder brother hid in the back seat. But they didn't find him there. In 10 minutes, he was gone without a trace. Almost about 3 years ago, my brother and I were making a cross-country journey, and we were planning on stopping off in Arizona to meet some friends. As soon as we entered Arizona, there were highway notices everywhere that there was an escaped convict. Now it was about 2 a.m. by the time we got there, so we were already in a bit of a strange mood. There was something about the entire drive through the desert that felt super eerie. And it was strange to a point that one of us even mentioned it, and we started joking about the spooky claims people make while traveling through the area. You know, like the existence of aliens that abduct unwary travelers, skinwalkers chasing you down, and ghosts that haunt drivers. While we were having this conversation, this crazy-looking animal ran across the road right in front of us. At first, I thought it was a deer, but it looked too wolf-like to be a deer. But it moved like a deer and was too lanky to be a coyote. And it even had a long tail like that of a cougar. Moreover, it was big. I slammed on my brakes, and it ran off into the brush on the side. We both just started screaming and then laughing. We have no clue what it was. At first, I thought that it must be a cougar with mange. But the more I thought about it, the less sure I was of what it was that we saw. It also didn't make any noise like a growl or a scream out of shock. My house is on a back road in the country, and so whenever I need to head to town, I have to travel through this small Amish settlement. And I almost always end up having to pass by an Amish carriage. It's a common occurrence, and they're usually friendly and pull as much to the side as they can, so as to let cars pass them by. But this one time I was behind an Amish carriage, it was going unbelievably slow. So I came up behind them, checked to make sure it was clear, and passed by. And I very vividly remember looking at them as I passed in my rear view, looking ahead to the road, and then looking back in my rear view to see that nothing was there. No horse, no carriage, and no human. And mind you, there were no roads to turn on, nor hills to cut off my sight. 1 second they were there, and the very next they just weren't. And I have never had a ghost-like experience before. Nor have anyone heard about such paranormal experiences in the village. I wasn't drunk, and I still have no explanation. I have heard about phantom trucks and such phenomena. But phantom horses? That's a new thing for me. Thank you so much for listening to these stories, and moreover, for making my previous video get over 1,000 views within 48 hours. Also, our horror community has grown quickly because of it. So share this video to as many as you can, and let's grow our horror community.